As a female physicist, I'm excited to continue the seminar series, Our Inclusive Path Forward, addressing inequities in STEM education. If that isn't a wicked problem, I don't know what is. The series features lectures by national leaders in the areas of recruiting, retaining, and graduating a diverse population of students in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. As part of our commitment to making Ohio State STEM programs more equitable and inclusive. We clearly have a lot of work to do. Our technical fields are still far too homogeneous, and we need to ensure we're changing our systems to welcome and hold space for people of color and other underrepresented groups. We're grateful to have Dr. Jordan Gerton here with us tonight. Dr. Gerton is the co-director of the Utah Pathways to STEM initiative and the director of the Center for Science and Mathematics Education and a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Utah. Before I introduce Dr. Gerton, though, I have a few announcements. First, I want to thank our series sponsors at Ohio State, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the College of Education and Human Ecology, the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences, the Michael V. Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning, the Office of Student Academic Success, and Ohio State's regional campuses. Second, I would encourage you to take a few moments after tonight's lecture to sign up for our last lecture at go.osu.edu/inclusivestem, and that is one word. Lastly, one quick housekeeping item. To ask a question, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Karen Goodell, professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at Ohio State, Newark, will be moderating the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Gerton. As I mentioned, Dr. Jordan Gerton is a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Utah. He also serves as the director of Utah's Center for Science and Mathematics Education and the co-director of the Utah Pathways to STEM initiative. Dr. Gerton runs an experimental optics research group that develops ultra-high resolution imaging and spectroscopy techniques. His work also includes reforming individual courses in science education, developing instructional support programs, and building an interdisciplinary science education research cluster. Dr. Gerton earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Arizona and earned a master's degree and doctorate in physics from Rice University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerton.
Thank you, Dr. Newton, and thank you all for joining this seminar and for organizing this seminar series. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Does everybody see that okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging in this kind of work. And I'm really honored to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing at the University of Utah. I feel incredibly honored and humbled to be sharing this seminar series with these other amazing people, some of whom I know and many of whom I know their work. It's really humbling to be included. And so I really thank the organizers again and the sponsors for organizing the series and for the invitation. Susan Olesick, in particular, Dean Olesick, who initially reached out to me for this invitation. I want to just sort of start by kind of reflecting on, this past year and all of the events and trauma and really life-changing, history-changing events that have happened, and these and more, and to really just kind of reflect on what this has meant for our society in terms of highlighting really and really surfacing for many people the inequities and the systemic racism and systemic systems of oppression that have been operating in our country for many years, and including in higher education. And I just think that the work, this seminar series probably is in part a response and an attempt to sort of really help move the Ohio State University forward. And like many other institutions are really doing some deep thinking and reflection on their role in the role that we play in systems of oppression. And in thinking about this, I was fortunate enough to come across some words and some writing by a colleague of yours at the Ohio State University in the School of Communication, Dr. Jasmine Roberts. And I think back in June, during the summer when there were lots of anti-racist protests happening and all sorts of other events, she was writing about how white faculty can help support and have conversations with people of color, students, colleagues, and how we can really come to this work with intention and with reflection. And I think she's really dropping some wisdom here. And so some of the things that she's sort of recommending that we do when we come to work that has to do, when we're working on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education and other settings. And I think that one of the things that I reflect on is that we are all responsible for making change in our institutions. White faculty and staff must help do the work to build a more equitable system, even though the system has really privileged white people since universities have started, and we have to be part of the work to make it more equitable. And so in thinking about that, I wanted to just offer a little bit about me, about the identities that I carry with me when I go through life and when I do any sort of work, and particularly the kind of work where we're engaging in issues of equity. And I think it's important for us all to, as Dr. Roberts sort of suggested, we really have to recognize our privilege and really be willing to do the work. And so I bring these identities with me to the work. And I wanted to specifically say that I do not have any formal training or any scholarly expertise in equity and inclusion. As Dr. Newton mentioned, I am a physicist. I have a research lab. I also have the good fortune to have been involved in education initiatives and in just improving and thinking and reflecting on teaching and education more broadly for many years. And I'm working really hard, as many are, to sort of develop a deeper understanding of issues of race and equity and inclusion. But I just want to own that I don't have scholarly expertise. And I think that is both to say that some of the scholars that you have in this seminar series are really amazing, deeply committed, deeply recognized scholars in these areas. And that's not who I am. And also to say that if I can engage in this work in the ways that I'll describe to you, other people that are also primarily scientists can do this as well. Okay, so what I hope to do in the 35 or 40 minutes or so that I have today are to primarily three things. I hope to provide some insight into how you might go about starting faculty communities. So when I was corresponding with Dean Olesic about the seminar series, and we had a discussion about what maybe I could talk about, the idea which she seemed to be most interested in and excited about was to talk about faculty communities and the power of faculty communities. And so I'll tell you about a faculty community that we've started, and I'll try to give you some insight into how you might go about starting faculty communities for particular purposes. And I think there probably faculty communities, faculty learning communities, communities of action already at the Ohio State University. And so for some of you, this may already be understood. I just don't want to assume this is already understood. I'll also try to, most of my talk will be how, demonstrating how at least our faculty community has had a broad impact on equity and inclusion. And I would say both, actual impact, but also the potential for much more impact. And so I think I want to demonstrate that to sort of motivate why you would want to start and sustain faculty communities in the first place. And I will close by sort of discussing how faculty communities can be sustained. Okay, so this will all be, the work that I'll tell you about is in the context of a particular initiative called the Utah Pathways to STEM Initiative. This is an Howard Hughes Medical Institute funded initiative. It is part of a broader program at HHMI called Inclusive Excellence that involves 3 cohorts of funded institutions. We were part of the first cohort. And this project is actually led by my colleague, Dr. Holly Gotze. She's directing the Upstem project, and she's a colleague of mine in the Center for Science and Math Education, which, as Dr. Newton mentioned, I'm the director of. And the point, the goal really of the Upstem project is to build efficient pathways from Salt Lake Community College. Salt Lake Community College is our main transfer partner. Maybe about 30%, 20 to 30% of the students at the University of Utah actually go to start their education, their higher education at Salt Lake Community College. So we really want to help build efficient pathways to STEM degrees at the University of Utah, and also build a culture of inclusion to support transfer students, but not just transfer students, support students, success of all students, and really with an attention to historically marginalized students in STEM. I would say that this particular project prioritizes infrastructure building and capacity building. It isn't a strongly student-facing program, but it is building the infrastructure that will allow us to have more robust student support moving forward. And I hope that becomes apparent as we go through. So there's sort of 4 or 5 main strategies that we utilize, that we deploy in our work. And 2 of them, the ones that I've sort of highlighted here, really rely on creating faculty communities. One of them to create degree work on degree articulation and efficient degree pathways, and one that is really broader than that, that is meant to just create a community for educators who are committed to inclusive excellence in STEM. And so those are, and I would say that when we started this work, we really didn't understand how powerful and important these faculty communities are and have turned out to be. And they were just sort of part of the strategy. And now I think as we've learned over the past 3 years, 2.5, 3 years, they are sort of the core of our work. Okay. And I also want to say, and go back for a second, when I say faculty community, I'm thinking of that a little bit more broad. I'm thinking of more than just faculty. We often have staff who are part of these communities, instructional staff, advisors, for example. And we really, one of the nice things about them is that in that community, in those communities, there really aren't hierarchies in the way that they exist in other places and other spaces. So some of the things that we've learned about starting a faculty community that seem to be, at least in our context, seem to be important. We think it's important, it's been important to us to really build a community around a particular purpose. So to try to identify a problem or an issue that really needs attention. And in our case, right, these communities, these faculty communities were developed in the context of our transfer, this collaboration with our transfer partner and thinking about transfer students and historically marginalized students. But I think this will depend on the particular context of of your institution and other things. And so, and I would say that we learned that it's probably best not to be too specific with with identifying that problem and the goals, because there are some unanticipated outcomes. So we should expect the unexpected. These communities that we've created and that we're supporting really have led to interesting things that we had no idea that would come out, and we didn't plan for it, and we didn't have those as goals. And yet it's aligned with what we're trying to do, which is to build capacity around inclusivity, and it's wonderful. Basically, let faculty be faculty. Faculty and staff do amazing things. They're creative agents. They are committed, and so it seems important that not to constrain the problem too much. We find that it's important to incentivize participation. It's inequitable to ask people to do work that goes above and beyond and not compensate them in some way. So in our case, we actually, because we have a grant at the moment, we pay our what we call fellows, but I think there are other ways of compensating. The point is, it really needs to be incentivized in some way and recognized. We found that it's important to start by recruiting. When we first started this, we worked hard to find people who were already engaged and they were already sort of leaders in their departments. They were well respected, and we worked with them first, both because they were willing to provide us input and feedback, but also because then they can help recruit others to the enterprise. And so start with the engaged leaders and then move beyond that. And we found that it's really important to be transparent about the goals and expectations that we have for people who are engaging in this work with us. And so and also to set norms about how we interact with each other, and but also, how often, be really transparent about how often we're expecting people to show up, and those kinds of things. And then I would say, really importantly, and sometimes overlooked, perhaps in this kind of work, particularly in an academic context, is we really want to not just make space for socialization and celebration, but to really make it happen, to really help make it happen, so that to help really build a community. And I would just sort of goes back to the first issue here, not making the problem or the issue too narrow. That becomes sort of a task force or a working group, which is important and productive. But if you really want to create community and you really want to change the culture, right, you really have to do things that go beyond the work. And so we do things like provide excellent meals when we meet. We have celebrations each semester. We invite leadership to recognize the people who are involved, and so I think those we found to be really important. Okay, so the faculty community that predominantly I'll be talking about, we call the Upstem Faculty Fellows. And so far, we've had 31 fellows spread across 2 different cohorts. We have faculty fellows from both the University of Utah, the U, and from Salt Lake Community College, SLCC. And we've had about 15 to 16 in each of the cohorts. To date, the commitment has been for 2 terms, so 2 semesters, but most of our fellows have actually wanted to continue to stay engaged for at least a 3rd semester. And so we've been, most of our fellows have actually kind of stayed part of the program for 3 terms. We meet between every other week to once a month, depending on the time of year. Obviously, over the last year, everything has been virtual, and that's changed the dynamics quite a bit, but it's still been really, our second cohort has been largely virtual, and yet they've been productive, and I think they've felt a sense of community. The sort of goal initially of creating this community was to really provide professional development on inclusive teaching, and also sort of leadership development. And we thought that the leadership development could be useful. It could be a useful hook to get faculty interested, but also because we really envision these fellows as kind of embedded agents of change within their units. And so and so we wanted to give them some concrete tools and expertise and competency around inclusive teaching and some leadership skills. And then as we progressed through this, we realized we realized at the beginning, and the way that we've done this has changed over time, but we really wanted to develop a deeper understanding about systemic racism and systems of oppression and the history of our country and academia. And so we've done things like listen to podcasts and really had deep reflections and facilitated conversations around the issues that come up. So a couple of the podcasts that we've been discussing, and which I really highly recommend, are the Who We Are podcast by Jeffrey Robinson and Carvel Wallace, and also the second season of the Scene on Radio podcast, which is called Seeing White, by John Biewen and Chandrai Kumanyika. And these are really excellent. They're very well done, and they really reference a lot of the scholarship as well. So you can really follow that up with a lot of reading as well. And so I should also say that these fellows are really drawn from mostly the College of Science at the University of Utah, and also the STEM disciplines in the Salt Lake Community College. So our fellows get personal and professional development from this experience. But we also found that most of the downstream or broader impact that they have comes when they start working on group projects. So fellows self-organize into teams of 3 to 5 or so. I mean, it can be more, it can be less. That just seems to be what's happened so far. And they identify a project or a problem or an issue of their choice, and they self-organize around that, and they work on it with support from the project team, the Upstem team, and other people that they can access. And I think some of these projects are pretty small and like really bite-sized, and some of them are actually more ambitious and take persist well beyond the ending of their sort of fellowship, but they're highly engaged and invested and continue to work on these things. And so I'm going to talk about sort of 5 general projects or groups of projects. One that has to do with developing a climate action plan, curricular changes, inclusive instruction resources, education research, and then a STEM StoryCorps project. So this is the part of the talk where I'm really trying to demonstrate sort of the broader impact of our faculty community in terms of equity. Okay, so one of the things that we did in the Upstem project was that we did a climate assessment. So we have a member of our leadership team, Jason Taylor, who's a professor of education, leadership, and policy at the University of Utah, whose scholarship area is in transfer, transfer students, transfer student success. And he and his research team designed 2 different surveys, climate surveys, one that was administered to faculty, staff, and TAs. So graduate students, some graduate students, and one that was administered to students, undergraduate and graduate students. And these were administered in the fall of 2018, about a year into our project. And really, we were intending to assess the climate for people historically marginalized in STEM, and to establish a baseline for the climate that we could then use to compare with later on when we do longitudinal assessment. The surveys, we had surveys and focus groups. You can see the numbers of usable responses. And then these, the data team, Jason Taylor's team, went and analyzed the results and sort of came up with findings, and which were then put into a very extensive report An example of the finding, just a finding, was for that faculty, staff, and TAs really placed a high value on diversity, so they personally value diversity, but they appear to have trouble understanding how to turn that into action. So they reported low frequencies of critical consciousness and action, again, which is related to sort of operationalizing that value. And so that kind of finding tells us something about what we might want to do. We might want to provide professional development or some other kind of mechanism to help faculty, staff, and TAs learn how to take action, for example. So you all may have administered or been asked to participate in a climate assessment at some point, a climate survey, and there's a big question, which is like, what happens with the data? What do you do with it? And so, how do you disseminate it? Who do you disseminate it to? How to take action, and with whom? Who are you going to partner with? What's that going to look like? There's always skepticism, and it comes in different forms. Some more, I think, legitimate than others. And so I think all these questions, I think, are pretty standard for when you give a climate assessment. And we were wrestling with these as well. And we realized at some point that as we had our first cohort of Upstem fellows, that they had already self-identified and had received professional development around equity and inclusion, and were highly invested in their own departments. And so we realized that maybe an interesting path forward would be to expose the Upstem fellows to the climate data and to carefully facilitate conversations around the data, and encourage them and hope that they could process that and come up with some ideas about how they could individually or as a college or as a department take action. And so that's what we ended up doing. And they, in fact, did come up with, at least a subset of the fellows came up with a climate action plan that then we submitted to the dean. And here are the elements, the broad elements of that action plan. Right, not surprisingly, being involved in experiencing professional development themselves at the time that they found meaningful, they wanted us to, they wanted more opportunities to engage in professional development, and they thought that would be useful for more people, particularly for resources and for improving classroom climate inclusivity. In thinking about how to actually know what the climate in the classroom is and what students are experiencing, they thought, well, maybe we should think about a college-wide peer observation approach to provide formative feedback on teaching. And so, instead of using only student surveys, course surveys, end of semester surveys, have a standard peer observation protocol, which is really primarily for formative feedback, not for evaluation. And then in addition to that, paired with that, maybe add some questions to the student course evaluations to assess students' experience with the classroom climate. They also recommended an annual teaching discovery day to promote teaching and transparency, transparency in teaching and collaboration, basically opening up classrooms for a day or a week a year, and for faculty to visit each other's classrooms and to actually have facilitated conversations about their reasons for enacting particular instructional approaches. This actually came from an idea. I was on sabbatical at UT Austin, and the College of Natural Sciences there actually does this, and I experienced it when I was there, and it was great, and brought that back to the conversation, and the fellows were excited about that. They also talked about establishing a college-level equity, diversity, and inclusion committee to help coordinate and catalyze across units, and also to establish a college inclusive excellence fellowship program, which basically they were saying, we like being an Upstem fellow. We know that this is funded by a grant. We think that this should persist beyond the period of grant. That is, that the university should institutionalize it, or the college should institutionalize it. So I don't have time to talk about all these elements. I'll just mention real brief. I'll just say one thing is that just an example of how this led to this action plan lined up with and it kind of led to or at least contributed to the professional development piece. When COVID hit and we were all locked down, and we were scrambling to figure out what to do about instruction, the CSME rounded up some of the Upstem fellows and also some additional faculty and staff, and we organized some remote instruction workshops where the Upstem fellows played a very prominent role both in organizing these and in facilitating them. So they were the expertise, they were the resource for their colleagues. And so we did a number of workshops, we did county halls, and we also had some working groups that were wrestling with remote labs and large enrollment courses, throughout the spring and the summer. And again, they played an important role. Just as an example of how equity comes into this, when we did our workshop on that focused on assessment and grading practices, we talked about Sylvia Hurtado's work at UCLA, where she demonstrated that norm-based grading or curve-based grading really disproportionately negatively impacts underrepresented minority students. And I'm so excited that Dr. Hurtado will be giving the next lecture in this series next week. So that's the Climate Action Plan. Another one of their projects or groups of projects was that the fellows worked on was to make some curricular changes. So, for example, there's a kind of a well-known math bottleneck where most four-year STEM curricula assume that students come in ready to take calculus, the first semester of calculus, but many, maybe most students, depending on the institution, that's not the case. And on top of that, right, STEM courses are stacked up with prerequisites. And so students often can't even begin their STEM major coursework until their third or fourth term. And that leads often to them switching majors or to taking too long and too much money to complete. Big problem. And so the Upstem fellows, a subgroup of them, they found out about some work that was done, led by Nathan Klingbeil at Wright State University, where they teach a math for engineers course that basically unlocks prerequisites while students are moving through their math sequence. So it doesn't reduce the amount of math, but it allows them to access their majors coursework, their engineering coursework in this case, more quickly. And it's had really strong positive impacts. And so the Salt Lake Community College, some of the Salt Lake Community College members of our community, of our Upstem fellows, actually took this on and designed basically followed this model and have now started to teach and institute this approach. There are similar science on-ramp courses that are also being considered by some of the fellows at the University of Utah, but haven't been developed yet. They also, this was actually not really a group of Upstem fellows, but another faculty team that actually was working on degree articulation and starting in the biology department. And in doing that work, they created some very streamlined and well-articulated transfer degree pathways that linked coursework at Salt Lake Community College much more seamlessly to coursework at the University of Utah. And in doing that, they actually realized that it would be even much better if they actually created a new associate's degree, which they did, and which had to go all the way up and get approved by the system of higher education, and which is now approved and is going to be rolled out in the fall. And that was just addressed to really help students move through more efficiently, lose less credit, spend less money, waste less money, maintain and retain their financial aid better and for longer. Another group of fellows, several groups actually, have worked on developing or disseminating and sort of interpreting various inclusive instructional resources that you can see here, and have also organized those, some of them, into an organic website that they developed and the Center for Science and Math Education helps support, but the content largely comes from the fellows. And so this is still evolving, but I think it's a nice resource for that broadens their impact. There have been some educational research projects that have been kind of spurred by this. So two of them have come out that I know about that have come out of our Upstem Fellows community. One that focuses on, how does representing multiple identities in organic chemistry impact the students' attitudes and motivations to persist. And they're using, they're kind of implementing this resource that was developed by Shinsky and Tanner called Scientist Spotlights, and then measuring the impact of that. And then another one is really measuring the impact, trying to measure the impact of evidence-based changes to instructional approaches in a big intro biology class at Salt Lake Community College, and basically trying to measure the impact of that. So these are projects that came out of and collaborations that came out of the Upstem Fellows and have equity implications. Just wanted to plug this resource that was used that I just mentioned, Scientist Spotlights. They have something like 250 profiles and lots of reflection guides and things like that. And I'll also just say, I don't know Jeff Shinsky, but Kim Tanner is a really amazing biology education researcher and also really committed to equity and inclusion, and maybe another person to consider for a speaker. And this brings me to the last sort of project I talk about that kind of goes back to Dr. Roberts, giving us the wisdom to try to listen with humility, listen to the people most impacted by the systems of oppression and people of color in higher education. And these group of fellows basically, there's mostly focused at Salt Lake Community College, are gathering narratives from faculty, staff, and students of color and from other historically marginalized groups, and are really with the intent to try to allow them to give their experiences and to talk about their resiliency, and to really help and to really help deepen our understanding about the kinds of challenges and again the responses to those challenges that people are experience as they people of color experience as they move through the academic system. And so this is a really intentional project. It's you can imagine it has to be done very carefully because it shouldn't be extractive, and it shouldn't be tokenizing. And so I think the work is proceeding really deliberately, but I think it has a lot of promise. Okay, and so hopefully I've demonstrated that the potential for faculty communities to really have broad impact on issues related to equity. And I want to just say before closing, and thinking about how to sustain faculty communities and sustain their impact, and some of the things that we've learned, I would say, it's really important to really approach this work with humility and to really respect different perspectives, and to really come to an agreement with the people in the community about how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, and how we work with each other. And I think it's also important just to allow time and to provide opportunities to build trust. And so we've sort of adopted a mantra in our Upstem Fellows that we are imperfect agents of change, and we're pursuing imperfect progress. And so I think we are going to make mistakes. We are going to hurt people's feelings and maybe do even more damage and pain than that. And we just hope that we can build the trust to be able to have the resiliency that when those things happen, we can still move forward. It's obviously important to really engage leadership, so engage department chairs, deans, and also not just engage them, get their support, help them, try to help convince them to provide resources and other kinds of support to do this work. It's also, we found it seemed to be important to integrate leadership development. Faculty seem to be really hungry for leadership development in the context of a learning community, and particularly a learning community around inclusivity. And so, and that is great, because what we really are hoping for is that they will be, again, agents of change in their units. It's really important to close the loop, to keep the community informed, even after they're not a formal part. Let's say their fellowship has ended. Let them know when something that they did had an impact, or resulted in a follow-up action, or resulted in something. And so I think obviously that helps keep faculty wanting to come back and really wanting to engage. And I think it's also, of course, really important to be guided by research, and also to put together a diverse team of people with complementary expertise to facilitate and guide this work. And with that, I'll just acknowledge the amazing people who have been the most instrumental, I think, at least in the part of the project that has to do with our learning communities. As I mentioned, Holly Gotze, Dr. Holly Gotze is the director of Upstem and a colleague of mine in the Center for Science and Math Education. Craig Caldwell is actually the dean of Science, Math, and Engineering at Salt Lake Community College, and he has been all in from the beginning. Ali Rocks really coordinates all of our activities and efforts. Marianne Berzins has lots of experience at the University of Utah with faculty and staff leadership development, so she's played an important role. And I already mentioned Jason. Liz Rogers has also really helped us with the inclusive teaching and inclusive instruction pieces of our professional development. I want to just acknowledge that we hear the names of the two cohorts of Upstem fellows. And just to sort of point out that, right, again, these are, some of them are from Salt Lake Community College, some of them are from the University of Utah. Our degree articulation teams also, that also had faculty and staff. And with that, I will thank you for the invitation again. Thank you for your attention. And I am very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. This is Karen Goodell. I'm a professor of ecology, evolution, ecology, and organismal biology at the Ohio State Newark campus, and I'm going to be moderating this Q&A. I just want to thank Dr. Gerton for such a really stimulating talk. That was really superb, and questions have been rolling in as you've been talking. So I'm just going to read some of these out, starting with the ones with lots of thumbs up. So the first question is, can you talk a little bit more about how you got buy-in from faculty for your program? And I would add to that, sort of what kinds of incentives could one provide for faculty that would be a little bit more ongoing than a short-term grant? Right.
So I think, number one, I think it is important to try to thank you for the question, by the way. I think it's important to really, if the university finds this work meaningful, I think we need to work as a university to find funds. Okay, so I think universities spend money on things that they value, and so we need to do that. That's something that we have to do at the University of Utah too, as we, as the grant sort of rolls down. And so I would say, though, it is important. I think the fellows have valued getting paid. So we provide stipends, and the stipends, depending on the situation, we pay our fellows $1,000 for their experience, but I think they may be interested in doing it for less than that. Some of them may not do it for less than that. It's not clear. That's not the main motivator, but it really is important, because we shouldn't establish an expectation that work on inclusivity is for free and that you do when you have time, right? It should be more central, I think. I think, faculty buyouts are things that sometimes, teaching buyouts are things that people think of. I think those are actually harder to do than just to come up with some money to pay, right? They have much more downstream consequences. You have to find somebody to teach your class and things like that. So, but I think that they can be appropriate in certain cases, like if there's a really heavy project that, you want to create a community around, and it's going to take a significant fraction of somebody's time. I think that it seemed that leadership development, offering leadership development as a piece of this seemed to be a hook. And so I would say, look around campus, find people who know how to do leadership development well, and try to engage them on your team.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. The next question is, could you describe the selection process for the Upstem Fellows?
Okay. We really wanted to be as inclusive as possible. So what we did was that we recruited by, just sending out, we created a flyer. We kind of laid out our expectations. We sort of laid out what it was about and kind of how often we expected to meet, and what the point of it was, right? What the goals were. And we worked with we initially worked with department chairs and deans to find people who they thought were kind of already, kind of leaders in their units, and that were engaged, and so would be interested in this kind of work, even if they hadn't engaged in like obviously inclusive instruction or something like that, but they were open to that and were influential. And so we sent out a very broad call for applications, but we also had some very targeted invitations, working with leadership to identify specific people. And I think we didn't really select in the sense of, turn people away, really. I think there were some people who, once we started talking with them about what the expectations were, they didn't have the time at that moment. And so we really just wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And so we expect that over time, sometimes the community will be bigger, sometimes the community will be smaller, just based on, who can engage at that time.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question is, it's a little long, but I'm going to read it all because it's very interesting. It says, the faculty communities look fantastic. Thanks for describing what these folks have done. My worry is a little about how we got here with systemic issues that have resulted in inequities and the possibility that programs such as faculty communities, while great, are one and done. Can you speak to ideas of systemic continuing faculty and departmental incentives and awards that can promote involvement in equity and inclusion? I'm thinking of faculty annual reviews, P&T, and budget models for departments that are incentivized toward efficiency.
Okay. And shout out to Andrew Heckler. I'm a big fan. So I think that's a deep question. Actually, that's more than one question. But I guess what I can say is that in our discussions with the faculty fellows, they themselves said, we need to get at promotion and tenure, right? We need to find ways to integrate values around inclusion and equity into P&T. And so, so one of the things that I think starts to get in that direction, and it was discussed in that regard in the faculty fellows, I mentioned potentially a college-wide peer observation of teaching approach. And so the fellows themselves said, we should be opening up our classrooms. We should be talking about teaching more in the ways that we talk about research more. We should, these should be a part of our normal conversation. And part of that is just like opening it up, right? Like we talk about our research openly. And so that was sort of some of the parts of their action plan were tuned to that. Now, nothing in that action plan really gets directly to promotion and tenure, other than that these peer observation could in principle be used as a part of the teaching portfolio. So I think that I should say that separate from the faculty fellows, separate from Upstem, right? There is work in my department about, and it's kind of hard work, and it's sort of very contentious work to to talk about how we integrate, diversity, equity, inclusion into our promotion and tenure guidelines in our department and our review. And so I don't have an answer. I really don't. All I can say is I think if the work is valuable that these kinds of communities do, I think that the university or the college at some level needs to keep supporting it, and they need to support it with money. And if they support it with money, I think faculty can, at least some faculty will engage, even if it isn't part of promotion and tenure, because they'll get meaning out of it and they'll make an impact.
Thank you very much for that. Our next question from Nicholas Denton is, any advice on incentivizing year-round college-wide teaching and learning communities? Some overlap here. And all the instructors in my college are doing great inclusivity work as individuals, but are feeling too time constrained to pursue research collaborations and publications while classes are running.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a general strategy. What I can say is that it's not going to work for everybody, but I mean, these fellows, none of whom I don't think any of the fellows, I'm not 100% sure for the fellows that came from Salt Lake Community College, but the fellows from the University of Utah did not get any sort of teaching relief, okay? So they got a little bit of money and they got a community, but they engaged in some of the, I mentioned a couple of these education research projects. They are doing that because they want to do it, and they're doing it and they feel well supported in doing it. But they didn't have space made for it. They made it themselves. I don't know, year round, I think, the other thing to keep in mind is just that we all do need our own time. We need our own personal time. So summer, we've not tried, well, I should say this summer during COVID, we did run, once a month meetings for the fellows who had started in the spring. And we mostly focused on listening to podcasts and discussing those things and sort of educating ourselves in the moment, right? This was when George Floyd was murdered and the protests. And so we were educating, we were really trying to understand more deeply what was happening in our country. And I think that and so that's what we did this summer, but I think it's also important for us to leave space in the summer. I think during the academic year is great because a lot of the work does sync up with the academic schedule anyway. So yeah, again, I don't really have I feel like that's a non-answer. Yeah, sustainability and like keeping it going is important. I think the only thing you can say is if you can do meaningful work and convince leadership that it's meaningful, we should be able to find money to help support it. And then finding time is up to faculty, I guess.
Yeah, it does sound like we're really talking about a big cultural shift that needs to happen, and hopefully that will happen fairly quickly. What were underrepresented groups identified in the climate survey? Did they include collecting data on LGBTQ and differently abled neurodivergent folks?
Yeah, so it was a pretty broad survey, and the data was disaggregated in lots of different ways. And yeah, so we were certainly trying to understand the climate, not just around race, but also around ableism and gender and sexual orientation and identity. And so, and also like in STEM, right? It's also, and also we were looking at, differences between staff perceptions and faculty perceptions, for example, and there are big differences there. And so, yes, we were trying to be pretty broad and inclusive in the what we were probing, and again, the climate survey was really administered to the College of Science at the University of Utah. It's about 2,000 undergraduate majors and a few hundred graduate students. I think that the College of Mines and Earth Sciences, which is a much smaller college, also did one that was related to ours, but it's separate from this project. I didn't report the results. So yeah.
Great. Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up because our time is up, and there are a lot of other questions, and we promised to share those with Dr. Gerton, and hopefully there'll be a format where he can help answer some of those. I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Gerton, and thanks to everyone who attended this really stimulating session. Please be sure to visit go.osu.edu inclusive STEM, and you'll there find a place where you can register for next week's seminar in this series.
Thank you, Dr. Goodell, and thank you, The Ohio State University, for the invitation.